Some people live their lives as if they are slightly out of sync with their own existence, not absent, not ignored, but quietly unacknowledged. They participate in conversations, relationships, routines, yet something essential never quite lands. Their presence does not disturb the emotional surface of the world around them. They are included but not deeply registered, heard but not truly received. Over time, this creates a subtle form of disconnection, not from others, but from the feeling of being someone who matters in a lived, emotional sense. This invisibility is not dramatic. It has no clear beginning, no obvious cause. It forms gently through everyday moments that pass without reflection. And slowly, the self begins to feel less solid, less anchored, less real. The quiet absence. There is a particular kind of silence that does not come from being alone. It comes from being surrounded and still feeling emotionally untouched. The quiet absence is not loud enough to demand attention. It does not arrive as rejection or conflict. It arrives as subtle omission, as the feeling that one's presence does not meaningfully register in the emotional world of others. This recognition often begins with small, ordinary moments, being interrupted without apology, sharing a thought that is acknowledged but not remembered, sitting in a room where conversations continue smoothly, yet one's contribution leaves no trace. Nothing dramatic happens. No one is unkind. And that is precisely what makes it difficult to name. There is no clear wound, only a slow emotional fading. The mind does not immediately interpret these experiences as invisibility. Instead, it reframes them. People are busy. The moment was poorly timed. It was not important. But when these explanations repeat too often, something deeper begins to form. A quiet awareness that emotional presence is not being mirrored, that reactions are minimal, that curiosity about one's inner world is absent. To be emotionally mirrored is to feel that one's feelings create movement in another person. A shift in attention, a pause, a question. When this mirroring does not occur, the self begins to feel unanchored, as if existing without emotional gravity. Over time, invisibility becomes internalized. The person stops expecting to be noticed, stops anticipating emotional response. Not consciously, but instinctively. Their voice softens. Their expressions become restrained. Their inner world slowly adapts to the space it is given. The quiet absence is not painful in a sharp way. It is numbing. It does not produce anger or despair. It produces neutrality, a sense of emotional transparency, of being present without being felt. And the most unsettling part is that this absence feels normal. It becomes the emotional baseline. The self learns how to exist without leaving impressions, without requiring recognition, without taking emotional space, not because there is nothing inside, but because the world has not reflected it back. Where it began in visibility rarely begins in adulthood. It is often learned long before the mind has language for it. In early environments where emotional needs were not met, children adapt not by protesting, but by observing. When a child's feelings are overlooked, dismissed, or inconsistently acknowledged, the psyche does not interpret this as neglect. It interprets it as reality. The emotional environment becomes the blueprint for how connection works. Some children grow up in homes where care exists, but emotional attunement does not. They are fed, protected, educated, yet their inner experiences remain largely unrecognized. Their sadness is minimized. Their excitement is tolerated but not shared. Their questions are answered but not explored. Over time, the child learns that emotional expression does not change anything. So, expression becomes unnecessary. This adaptation is quiet. The child becomes self-contained, observant, emotionally independent far too early, not because they are strong, but because no one is consistently available to witness their inner world. They become the kind of child who does not demand, who does not interrupt, who does not ask to be held emotionally, not out of maturity, but out of emotional self-preservation. The psyche begins to associate safety with invisibility, with being low maintenance, with not requiring attention. The child learns how to be present without being disruptive, how to exist without taking up emotional space. And this pattern hardens into identity. In adulthood, this often manifests as being easy to be around, the reliable listener, the adaptable partner, the emotionally steady one, the person who rarely expresses need. But beneath this stability is a history of emotional self-erasure, of learning that being seen is unpredictable, that emotional recognition cannot be relied upon. So, the self learns to remain partially hidden, to observe rather than participate, to exist without emotional demand. Invisibility becomes not something that happens to them. It becomes something they unconsciously maintain. The invisible mind. From a psychological perspective, invisibility is not a personality trait. It is a relational pattern. It forms through repeated experiences of emotional non-mirroring. Human identity develops through reflection. The mind learns who it is by observing how it is received. When a feeling is mirrored, it gains emotional reality. When it is ignored, it slowly loses form. Attachment theory suggests that when emotional responses are inconsistent or absent, individuals develop internal models that devalue their own emotional significance. They may believe their feelings are excessive, irrelevant, or burdensome. This belief does not appear as a conscious thought. It exists as an emotional posture, a way of holding oneself in the world. The invisible mind becomes hyper-aware of others, attuned to subtle shifts in mood, tone, and atmosphere, yet disconnected from its own emotional signals. This creates an imbalance. The person becomes emotionally perceptive but self-silencing, highly empathetic but internally distant. Social identity forms around adaptability. They fit into spaces easily, but rarely reshape them. They become emotionally fluent in other people's inner worlds, while remaining unclear about their own. Psychologically, this leads to a weakened sense of self-concept, not low self-esteem in the traditional sense, but low emotional presence, a sense that one's inner experiences lack weight. They may struggle to feel real in relationships, to believe their emotions matter, to trust that their presence makes a difference. The invisible mind is not empty. It is overquiet. It holds complexity, sensitivity, and depth. But these qualities remain internal, unmirrored, and therefore emotionally unanchored. The person does not disappear from life. They disappear from emotional impact. The inner conflict at the center of invisibility lies a paradox. The desire to be seen exists alongside a fear of being exposed. The invisible person longs for recognition, but feels unsafe when attention approaches. Being emotionally visible feels both necessary and threatening. This creates an internal conflict, a constant oscillation between wanting connection and avoiding it, between craving intimacy and retreating into self-silence. They may feel deeply yet rarely express it, think profoundly yet speak minimally, want to be known yet fear the consequences of being understood. Emotionally, they learned that visibility is unpredictable, that attention may disappear, that expression may not be met, so the psyche associates emotional openness with risk. As a result, invisibility becomes self-sustaining. They minimize their needs, downplay their experiences, soften their reactions. They over-adapt to social environments, becoming whatever feels least disruptive, not because they lack identity, but because they learn to protect it through concealment. The inner conflict is not conscious resistance. It is emotional reflex. They do not think, "I will hide." They feel it is safer to remain small, and so the desire to be seen never disappears. It remains quietly present, but it is filtered through caution, restraint, and emotional self-control. The invisible person lives between longing and withdrawal, between presence and absence, between wanting connection and fearing emotional disappointment, not because they are distant, but because they learn to exist without being witnessed. The moment of awareness, the turning point, does not arrive as clarity. It arrives as grief. There is a moment when invisibility becomes conscious, when the person recognizes not just current disconnection, but a lifelong pattern of emotional absence. It often happens in stillness, a pause between relationships, a quiet realization during solitude, the sudden awareness that one has lived for years without feeling deeply seen. This awareness is not dramatic. It is heavy. The person begins to notice how often they were emotionally overlooked, how rarely they were asked meaningful questions, how little space their inner world occupied in shared relationships. And with this awareness comes mourning, not for lost people, but for a lost version of the self, the one that could have existed with emotional support, with recognition, with presence. The grief is subtle but profound. It is the grief of emotional non-existence, of realizing how much of one's inner life went unwitnessed. This moment does not produce blame. It produces quiet sadness, a sense of emotional invisibility finally becoming visible to oneself. And that recognition changes everything, because for the first time, the person sees their own absence. Learning to exist, healing invisibility, is not about becoming louder. It is about becoming real. It begins internally, with learning to emotionally acknowledge oneself, to validate feelings without waiting for external recognition, to allow inner experiences to exist without permission. This process feels unfamiliar. The invisible person is accustomed to minimizing, to downplaying, to adapting. Now they must learn how to occupy emotional space within themselves, not through performance, not through attention, but through presence. They begin to notice their feelings instead of suppressing them, their needs instead of dismissing them, their boundaries instead of dissolving them. Externally, healing does not require dramatic change. It requires subtle authenticity, speaking when something matters, pausing when something feels wrong, allowing silence to exist without self-erasure. The goal is not to be seen by everyone. It is to be present with oneself, and through that presence, emotional connections begin to shift naturally. Relationships become fewer but deeper, quieter but more real. Visibility becomes an internal state before it becomes an external one. The presence within, to be seen, is not to be noticed. It is to be emotionally felt. True visibility does not come from attention, admiration, or recognition. It comes from emotional existence, from allowing one's inner world to take up space. The presence within is the realization that invisibility was never the absence of others. It was the absence of emotional self-recognition. The invisible person learns that being witnessed begins internally, that emotional presence does not require permission, that the self does not need to disappear to remain safe, and slowly something shifts. The voice becomes steadier, the body feels more grounded, the inner world feels less distant, not because the world suddenly changes, but because the self finally arrives. Visibility is not about being remembered, it is about being real.